6 months ago, I was in a terrible car accident. My wife and 2 adult children walked away with minor injuries. I was in ICU for weeks fighting to survive. When I finally woke up, my family was gone. They left me a note saying my medical bills would bankrupt them and they had to think of their own futures. They abandoned me at the hospital and never came back. Last week they saw me on national television and their jaws dropped. What happened next changed everything. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. 6 months ago, I'd been driving my family to a lakeside cabin we'd rented for a week-long vacation, had my wife Linda in the passenger seat and my 2 adult children Sarah and Michael in the back, all of us excited about getting away from the city and spending time together doing nothing but relaxing and enjoying each other's company. We'd been planning this trip for months, had picked a beautiful cabin on a quiet lake about 3 hours from home, had loaded the car with groceries and games and books. Had been looking forward to disconnecting from our busy lives and just being a family for a week. I'd been driving carefully like I always did when I had my whole family in the car with me, had been going the speed limit and paying attention to traffic, had stopped at a red light at a major intersection about an hour into our drive. The light had turned green and I'd checked both directions before starting to move forward through the intersection. Had been maybe halfway through when I'd seen a massive truck coming from the right side, running the red light at full speed with no signs of slowing down or even noticing the traffic signal. I'd had maybe 2 seconds to react, had seen that truck barreling toward us, and had known immediately that we were going to be hit, that there was no way to avoid it or get out of the way in time. I'd shouted for everyone to brace themselves and had tried to accelerate through the intersection to minimize the impact, but the truck had been going too fast and had slammed into the driver's side of my car with a force that had felt like an explosion, had crushed metal and shattered glass and sent us spinning across the intersection. The impact had been directly on my side of the car. The truck had hit right where I was sitting, and I'd taken the full force of it while my family on the other side of the vehicle had been relatively protected by my body and the car's structure absorbing most of the collision. I'd felt my pelvis shatter on impact, had felt ribs breaking and something tearing inside my chest, had felt my head slam against something hard despite the airbag deploying, and then everything had gone black as I'd lost consciousness from the trauma and the pain. I'd found out later from medical records that I'd been pulled from the wreckage by emergency responders, that I'd been unconscious and bleeding internally, that they'd rushed me to the nearest trauma center with sirens blaring while working to keep me alive in the ambulance. My injuries had been severe and life-threatening. I'd had a shattered pelvis that required multiple surgeries to repair, had broken 6 ribs with one of them puncturing my lung causing internal bleeding, had suffered a traumatic brain injury from the impact that had left me in a coma for 3 days while my brain swelled and doctors had monitored whether I'd survive or have permanent damage. Linda and the kids had been taken to the same hospital but had been treated in the emergency room for minor injuries and released the same day. Linda had some cuts and bruises and a sprained wrist. Sarah had a concussion and some bruising. Michael had walked away with just some glass cuts that needed stitches. They'd all been incredibly lucky. The impact on my side of the car had protected them from the worst of it. They'd been shaken and scared, but fundamentally okay while I'd been fighting for my life in the ICU. I'd been unconscious for 3 days, had been hooked up to machines breathing for me and monitoring my brain activity and keeping me alive while my body tried to heal from catastrophic trauma. The doctors had told my family the prognosis wasn't good, that I might not wake up, that if I did wake up I'd likely have permanent disabilities from the brain injury and the pelvic damage, that I was looking at months of hospitalization and rehabilitation, and possibly never walking normally again. When I'd finally regained consciousness on the 4th day after the accident, I'd been confused and disoriented, hadn't known where I was or what had happened, had felt pain everywhere in my body that was being managed by heavy medications. I'd opened my eyes in a hospital room filled with beeping machines and bright lights, had tried to move and had realized I couldn't, had felt panic rising as I'd tried to remember what had happened and why I was there. A nurse had noticed I was awake and had come over immediately, had checked my vital signs and had asked me questions to assess my mental state, had seemed relieved when I'd been able to answer correctly about my name and the year and basic information that showed my brain was functioning despite the injury. She'd explained gently that I'd been in a serious car accident, that I'd been unconscious for 3 days, that I'd sustained significant injuries and would need time to recover. I'd asked about my family, had tried to ask if Linda and the kids were okay, if they'd been hurt in the accident, if they were in the hospital somewhere. The nurse had looked uncomfortable, had hesitated before saying they'd been treated and released, that they were fine, that they'd left the hospital days ago. I'd felt relief hearing they were okay, had assumed they were at home recovering from their minor injuries, had thought they'd be back to visit me once I was awake and stable enough for visitors. But as hours passed, and then a full day passed with no sign of Linda or Sarah or Michael, no phone calls or messages or visits, I'd started to feel uneasy. The nurses had been kind, but had seemed to avoid my questions about my family, had changed the subject when I'd asked when they were coming to see me, had looked at me with expressions that seemed like pity mixed with discomfort. Something was wrong, but nobody would tell me what it was. On my second day of being conscious, a social worker had come into my room with an expression on her face that I'd known immediately meant bad news, the kind of carefully neutral professional face that people use when they have to deliver information that's going to devastate you. She'd introduced herself and had asked if I was feeling well enough to talk about some difficult things, had pulled up a chair next to my bed, and had looked at me with sympathy that had made my stomach drop even before she'd started speaking. She'd explained that my family had left the hospital shortly after I'd been admitted, that they'd stayed only long enough to be treated for their own injuries and to be told about my condition, and then they'd left and hadn't returned. I'd tried to defend them, had said they were probably just traumatized and needed time to process, that they'd come back once they'd recovered from the shock of the accident, but the social worker had shaken her head sadly and had told me there was more I needed to know. Linda had left a note with the hospital administrator, the social worker had explained, had put it in writing that they wouldn't be returning, that they were making a permanent decision about my care. My hands had started shaking as the social worker had pulled out a photocopy of the note and had offered to read it to me since I was still having trouble focusing my eyes well enough to read small print. I'd told her to just read it, had braced myself for whatever Linda had written, but nothing could have prepared me for the actual words. The note had said, "We can't handle this. The medical bills will bankrupt us, and he'll need care we can't provide. We're sorry, but we have to think of our own futures. Don't try to contact us." 12 years of marriage to Linda, 25 years of being Sarah's father, 23 years of being Michael's father, all reduced to a note that said they had to think of their own futures, and my catastrophic injuries were too expensive and too inconvenient for them to deal with. The social worker had watched me process this information, had seen my face as I'd understood that my family had abandoned me while I'd been unconscious and fighting to survive. I'd asked when they'd left the note, had hoped maybe it was something Linda wrote in the immediate aftermath when she was traumatized and scared, something she'd regret once she'd calmed down. But the social worker had told me Linda had left the note 6 hours after I'd regained consciousness, had known I was awake and stable and would survive, and had still chosen to abandon me. They'd waited just long enough to confirm I wasn't going to die immediately, and then they'd made their decision to walk away from me permanently. The social worker had continued explaining the situation, had told me that Linda had also blocked my number from all their phones, that when the hospital had tried to call her to discuss my care, she'd refused to take the calls, and had told the hospital administrator not to contact the family again. I'd tried calling Linda myself from the hospital phone once I was physically capable of using a phone, had wanted to hear her voice and understand why she was doing this, but the calls had gone straight to a message saying the number was no longer in service or had blocked my calls. Sarah and Michael had blocked me too. My own children, who I'd raised and loved and supported through everything, had decided I was too much of a burden to even speak to on the phone. I tried to tell myself they were just following Linda's lead, that my wife was controlling them, and they didn't really want to cut me off. But the social worker had gently explained that both Sarah and Michael were adults in their late 20s who'd made their own choices, that they'd each been asked separately if they wanted to be involved in my care, and they'd each independently said no. The social worker had then delivered what felt like the final blow, had told me that Linda had already filed paperwork to sell our house, the home where we'd lived for 15 years and raised our children, the place I'd thought I'd be returning to once I was well enough to leave the hospital. My family had moved out within days of the accident, had packed up everything that belonged to them, and had left my belongings in storage, had put the house on the market, and had split the proceeds between the three of them without any intention of using that money to help with my medical care. I'd lain there in that hospital bed trying to process that the people I'd loved most in the world had looked at my broken body and my uncertain future and had decided I wasn't worth the trouble, had chosen their financial security over their husband and father who'd been injured while driving them on a family vacation. The accident had been completely not my fault. A truck had run a red light and had hit us. I'd done nothing wrong except be in the driver's seat, which meant I'd taken the impact that had protected them from serious injury. I'd protected them with my body, had been the barrier between the truck and my family, had sustained injuries that would change my life forever because I'd been the one driving, and their gratitude had been abandonment. If Linda or one of the kids had been driving instead of me, they'd be the ones lying in this hospital bed with a shattered pelvis and broken ribs and brain injury, and I'd been certain I would have stayed by their side through every moment of recovery, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. But they hadn't extended me that same loyalty, hadn't felt that same obligation to stand by the person who'd protected them, had instead calculated that my injuries were too severe and too expensive, and had decided to save themselves. The social worker had tried to comfort me, had said that sometimes trauma makes people act in ways they wouldn't normally act, that maybe once some time passed my family would reconsider. But I'd known from the coldness of that note and the completeness of their abandonment that this wasn't a temporary reaction to trauma. This was a calculated decision made by people who valued money and convenience more than they valued me, made by a wife who'd promised in sickness and in health but had apparently meant that only as long as the sickness wasn't too expensive, made by children who'd been raised to believe family stuck together but had learned that lesson only applied when it was easy. I'd been left alone in an ICU room, unable to walk, barely able to speak, fighting to survive injuries that would disable me permanently, and my family had looked at that situation and had chosen themselves. I'd spent the next 3 months in that hospital with absolutely no visitors, no family members stopping by to check on my progress, no friends coming to sit with me, because Linda had apparently told everyone that I wanted privacy and didn't want visitors during my recovery. I'd found out later that she'd been actively lying to people in our social circle, had been telling them I was doing fine and preferred to be left alone, had been cutting me off from any support system that might have helped me through this nightmare while she and the kids had been moving on with their lives. The medical bills had started piling up almost immediately. I'd been in the ICU for 2 weeks before being moved to a regular hospital room, had undergone 3 major surgeries to repair my shattered pelvis and deal with internal injuries, had needed constant monitoring and care and medication that all cost money I didn't have. My insurance had covered some of it, but there'd been co-pays and deductibles and out-of-network charges that had added up to staggering amounts, and without Linda's income contributing to our household, I'd been facing financial ruin on top of physical devastation. Hospital social workers had been incredibly kind, had helped me apply for every form of assistance available, had worked with the hospital's financial department to set up payment plans and reduce some of the charges, had connected me with disability services and programs that could help. But even with all that help, I'd been looking at over $340,000 in medical debt, an amount so massive I couldn't even comprehend how I'd ever pay it off. An amount that would follow me for the rest of my life and destroy any chance I had of financial stability. Physical therapists had worked with me every day once I was stable enough to begin rehabilitation, had helped me learn to move again when my body felt completely foreign and broken, had pushed me through pain I'd never imagined possible as I'd tried to regain basic functions like sitting up or moving from bed to wheelchair. My pelvis had been shattered so badly that doctors had told me I'd never walk normally again, that I'd be dependent on mobility aids for the rest of my life, that I should prepare for permanent disability and chronic pain that would limit everything I could do. But something in those physical therapists' determination had sparked something in me, had made me refuse to accept that this was how my life would be forever, had driven me to push harder and work longer than anyone expected. I'd spent hours every day in physical therapy doing exercises that made me scream with pain, had forced my broken body to relearn movements it used to do without thinking, had refused to give up even when every part of me wanted to quit and accept defeat. After 2 months of intensive work, I'd been able to stand with assistance, had felt tears running down my face the first time I'd gotten to my feet, even though the pain had been excruciating, had felt something like hope for the first time since the accident. Another month of work, and I'd been able to take steps with a walker, shuffling slowly across the hospital room while therapists had cheered me on, making progress that doctors had said was remarkable given the severity of my injuries. By the time I'd been discharged after 3 months, I'd been able to walk with a cane, was still in significant pain and would never move the way I used to, but I was mobile and functional in ways that had seemed impossible when I'd first woken up paralyzed from the waist down. The physical therapists had called me their miracle patient, had said my determination and work ethic were unlike anything they'd seen, had told me I'd inspired them with my refusal to accept limitations. But even with that physical progress, the emotional wound of my family's abandonment had been festering, had gotten worse rather than better as time passed, and they'd maintained their complete silence. Not one phone call, not one text message, not one visit in 3 months of me fighting to survive and recover. They'd stuck to their decision to abandon me completely. I'd had time to think about what that meant, had processed that the people I'd loved and trusted had valued their financial security more than they'd valued me as a person. When I'd been discharged from the hospital, I'd had nowhere to go. My home had been sold weeks earlier, and I'd received notice through my lawyer that the proceeds had been divided 3 ways between Linda, Sarah, and Michael. They'd each gotten about $120,000 from selling the house I'd paid the mortgage on for 15 years, had split my equity like it was theirs to take, had used money that should have gone to my medical care to fund their fresh starts without me. I'd been discharged to a rehabilitation facility that accepted patients with catastrophic injuries and no family support, a place that was essentially a long-term care home for people who had nowhere else to go. I'd arrived there with 1 suitcase of clothes that social workers had bought for me since my family had taken everything I'd owned when they'd moved out, with a cane I'd need for the rest of my life, with debt that would take decades to pay off if I could even find a way to work with my disabilities. The other patients in the rehab facility had been kind. Many of them were in similar situations with families who'd abandoned them, or lives that had been destroyed by accidents or illnesses, and there'd been a grim solidarity in being surrounded by people who understood what it felt like to lose everything. But nothing could heal the specific wound of knowing my wife and children had looked at me broken and bleeding, and had decided I wasn't worth staying for, that my value to them had been conditional on my health and my ability to contribute financially. Something in me had refused to break, despite everything that had been designed to destroy me, despite losing my family and my home and my health and my financial security all at once. There'd been a core of rage and determination that wouldn't let me just give up and accept that this was how my life would end. I'd lain in that rehab facility bed for the first few nights feeling sorry for myself, had cried about the injustice of it all, had wished I'd died in that accident instead of surviving to face this nightmare. But eventually, the self-pity had turned into anger, and the anger had turned into fuel. I'd decided that if my family had abandoned me because they'd thought I'd be a burden and a financial drain, then I'd prove them spectacularly wrong, would show them that writing me off had been the biggest mistake they'd ever made, would build something from this disaster that would make them regret every moment of their cruelty. I didn't know yet what that would look like or how I'd accomplish it from a rehab facility bed with catastrophic injuries and massive debt, but I'd known I wasn't going to just fade away quietly like they probably expected me to. In that rehab facility, I'd met a man named David who was recovering from a severe stroke that had left him partially paralyzed on his left side. He'd been a tech entrepreneur before the stroke and was struggling to accept that his body had betrayed him the same way mine had been destroyed in the accident. We'd started talking during physical therapy sessions, had bonded over being relatively young men dealing with disabilities we'd never expected to face, had spent hours discussing business and technology and opportunities while other patients had watched television or slept. David had been sharp mentally despite his physical limitations, had still been thinking about startups and investments and market opportunities, even though he couldn't use his left arm properly anymore, had been looking for ways to stay engaged with the business world that had been his entire life before the stroke. He'd asked me about my background, and I'd told him about my work in medical device sales before the accident, about my understanding of healthcare systems and patient needs. about the insights I'd gained from being on the receiving end of medical care for 3 months. One day, after we'd been discussing the terrible state of medical diagnostics and how patients like us fell through cracks in the system, David had looked at me seriously and had said something that changed everything. He'd told me I had a sharp mind that was being wasted, sitting in a rehab facility, feeling sorry for myself. Had said my body was healing, but I was letting my brain waste away. Had asked why I wasn't using this experience to build something instead of just surviving it. He'd explained that he was involved with a startup that was developing AI-assisted medical diagnostic tools, technology that would help doctors catch diseases earlier and make better treatment decisions, and they needed someone who understood both the medical field and the patient experience. The company was still small and couldn't pay much initially, but they could offer remote consulting work that I could do from the rehab facility or wherever I ended up living, work that would use my mind even though my body was still broken. David had offered me a position doing consulting work for his startup, had said he'd pay me a modest hourly rate to start and see how things went, had told me this was a chance to prove I still had value beyond my physical mobility. I'd accepted immediately without even asking about the details. Had been desperate to prove to myself and to my absent family that I was more than the broken man they'd discarded. Had needed something to pour my energy into besides physical therapy and rage. The work had started simply enough. David would send me patient interface designs and diagnostic workflows, and I'd give feedback based on my experience as both a medical sales professional and a recent patient, would point out where the technology failed to account for real human needs and limitations. But as I'd gotten more involved, I'd started suggesting bigger changes, had begun proposing new features and approaches that came from my unique perspective of understanding both sides of the healthcare system. David had been impressed with my insights, had started involving me in more strategic discussions with the development team, had begun treating me less like a consultant and more like a partner in building something revolutionary. Within weeks, he'd offered me equity in the company in exchange for deeper involvement, had said my contributions were valuable enough that I deserved to share in the potential upside if the startup succeeded. I'd thrown myself into this work with an intensity that came entirely from abandonment and rage, had spent every moment I wasn't in physical therapy working on the startup, had used my pain and my anger and my determination to prove my family wrong as fuel for focusing on making this company successful. The nurses had commented on how I'd transformed from a depressed patient to someone who was constantly on video calls or typing on a laptop, how I'd found purpose that was helping me heal emotionally even as my body was still recovering physically. Success hadn't been my goal at first. Survival had been my only aim. Proving I could function despite my disabilities had been the baseline I was fighting for. But as the work progressed and the company started gaining traction, I'd realized that success was becoming possible, that this startup might actually become something significant, that the burden my family had abandoned might actually build something they'd never achieved themselves. That realization had driven me even harder, had made me work longer hours and push myself further, had turned my recovery into a mission to prove that abandoning me had been the worst decision my family had ever made. Within the first month of working with David's startup, I'd gone from hourly consultant to equity partner. David had been so impressed with my contributions that he'd offered me 20% ownership of the company in exchange for becoming a full partner rather than just a contractor. 20% had seemed like a meaningless number at the time since the company was worth essentially nothing, was just a handful of people working on technology that might never succeed, but I'd accepted because having ownership of something felt important when I'd lost ownership of everything else in my life. My insights from being a patient had helped revolutionize the user interface of their diagnostic software. I'd been able to point out exactly where doctors and nurses would struggle with the technology because I'd watched medical professionals struggle with existing systems during my 3 months in the hospital. I'd experienced firsthand how crucial timing was in medical decisions, how small delays caused by confusing interfaces could mean the difference between catching something early or missing it entirely. How frustrated healthcare workers became when technology got in the way instead of helping. The development team had initially been skeptical about taking design direction from someone who wasn't a trained engineer or designer, but when they'd actually implemented my suggestions and had tested them with real medical professionals, the feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. doctors had told us the interface felt intuitive in ways that other medical software never did, that it seemed designed by someone who actually understood clinical workflows, rather than by programmers who'd never set foot in a hospital. David had started bringing me into investor meetings via video call, had positioned my patient perspective as our competitive advantage in a crowded field of medical technology startups, had used my story of recovering from catastrophic injuries while helping build the company as part of our pitch to potential funders. Some investors had been moved by the narrative, others had just been impressed by the quality of our technology, but either way we'd started getting serious attention from venture capital firms. 4 months after I'd started working with the company, we'd closed a Series A funding round of $15 million, had convinced a major venture capital firm that our AI-assisted diagnostic technology was going to revolutionize how diseases were caught and treated. The funding had valued our company at $50 million, which meant my 20% equity stake was theoretically worth $10 million, an amount so absurd compared to my situation just months earlier that I'd had trouble believing it was real. I'd gone from being an abandoned hospital patient with $340,000 in medical debt to being a paper multimillionaire in the span of 4 months, had built value out of literally nothing except my determination to prove my family wrong and my unique perspective from being destroyed by the healthcare system. The money wasn't liquid yet since the company wasn't sold or public, but it was real enough that I'd been able to use my equity as collateral to negotiate settlements on my medical debt and secure loans to get myself out of the rehab facility and into an actual apartment. The success hadn't been my goal when I'd started. Survival had been my only objective when David had first offered me consulting work, but success had become the byproduct of refusing to let abandonment define me or destroy me. Every hour I'd spent working, instead of wallowing, had been driven by rage at my family. Every innovative idea I'd contributed had come from a place of wanting to prove I was valuable despite my disabilities. Every late night of pushing through pain to attend meetings had been fueled by determination to show that discarding me had been a mistake. David had told me repeatedly that I was the heart of the company, that my patient perspective was what made our technology different from everything else on the market, that investors believed in us because they believed in my story of surviving abandonment and building something meaningful from that survival. He'd said watching me transform from a broken man in a rehab facility to a driven entrepreneur had inspired everyone on the team, had shown them what was possible when someone refused to accept that their circumstances defined their potential. The other people working at the startup had become like family to me in ways my actual family had never been. They'd valued my contributions and had celebrated my successes and had supported me through the difficult moments when my physical pain had made work nearly impossible. They'd known my story, had known about my family abandoning me at the hospital, and they'd gone out of their way to make sure I felt included and appreciated and essential to what we were building together. Within 6 months of the accident that had destroyed my body and my family, I'd become a multimillionaire with a purpose, had proven that the burden my wife and children had abandoned was capable of building something they'd never achieved themselves. My 20% stake in a $50 million company meant I was worth more on paper than my family would probably earn in their entire lifetimes combined, meant the medical bills they'd been so terrified of had become irrelevant compared to my net worth. Our company's product launch had been scheduled for 6 months after the Series A funding round. David had insisted we needed that time to refine the technology and build relationships with hospital systems and get regulatory approvals, but he'd also been planning an aggressive media strategy to announce our arrival in the medical technology space. He'd hired a PR firm that had connections to major media outlets, had worked on crafting our story in ways that would appeal to both the healthcare industry and the general public, had positioned our launch as a breakthrough moment in diagnostic medicine. David had told me from the beginning that I needed to be the public face of the company, that my story as a patient who'd survived catastrophic injuries and had used that experience to build revolutionary technology was our most compelling narrative. I'd been reluctant at first because talking about my family's abandonment meant reliving that pain publicly, meant admitting to the world that my wife and children had thrown me away like garbage. But David had convinced me that my story could help other people who'd been abandoned or written off understand that their circumstances didn't define their worth. The PR firm had secured us an appearance on Good Morning America, one of the biggest morning shows in the country with millions of viewers. a platform that would introduce our company and our technology to a massive audience all at once. They'd wanted to do the interview the week of our product launch, had scheduled it for a Tuesday morning when viewership was typically high, had worked with the show's producers to craft questions that would highlight both the technology and the personal story behind it. Last Tuesday, I'd flown to New York for the interview, had stayed in a hotel the night before, and had barely slept because of nerves and excitement and the constant pain that still plagued me 6 months after the accident. I'd gotten up early to meet with the PR team and go over talking points, had put on the expensive suit they'd bought for me that made me look successful and professional despite the cane I needed to walk, had practiced staying calm and focused even though my heart had been racing with anxiety about being on national television. The Good Morning America studio had been overwhelming, bright lights and cameras and crew members moving around efficiently preparing for the broadcast. And I'd sat in the guest chair with my cane resting against the armrest, trying not to look as nervous as I felt. The host had been warm and professional during our pre-interview chat, had put me at ease by asking about my recovery and expressing genuine interest in our technology, had made the whole experience feel more like a conversation than an interrogation. When the cameras had gone live and the interview had actually started, I'd found myself speaking more naturally than I'd expected, had talked about our AI-assisted diagnostic technology and how it was going to help doctors catch diseases earlier and save lives, had explained the features and benefits in ways that made sense to regular people rather than just medical professionals. The host had been engaged and had asked good questions, had seemed genuinely excited about what we were building, had given me space to really explain why this mattered. Then she'd asked about the personal side of the story, had said she'd read in our press materials that I'd been inspired to work on this technology while recovering from a serious accident, had asked me to talk about that experience and how it had shaped my perspective. I'd taken a breath and had decided in that moment to tell the truth completely, to not soften or hide the parts about my family because their abandonment was fundamental to understanding what had driven me. I'd explained that I'd been in a catastrophic car accident 6 months ago, that I'd sustained injuries including a shattered pelvis and traumatic brain injury that doctors had said would leave me permanently disabled, that I'd spent 3 months in the hospital fighting to survive and learning to walk again. The host had made sympathetic sounds and had said something about how difficult that must have been, and that's when I'd added the part that made her face change completely. I'd said that my family had left me at the hospital because they thought I'd be a burden, had explained calmly that my wife and adult children had abandoned me to protect their financial future because my medical bills would have bankrupted them. The studio had gotten very quiet, the host had looked shocked, and I'd continued speaking in that same calm tone about how they'd never come back, how I'd recovered alone, how I'd built this company while they'd been moving on with their lives. The host had asked how that had made me feel, had seemed genuinely moved by what I was sharing, and I'd told her the truth, which was that sometimes the people who give up on you do you a favor. I'd explained that being abandoned had forced me to prove I had value beyond my physical mobility, had driven me to work harder than I ever would have otherwise, had ultimately led to me building a $50 million company and becoming a multimillionaire while recovering from the injuries my family had thought made me worthless. I'd mentioned my equity stake casually, had said that the burden my family had abandoned was now worth $10 million on paper and growing, had smiled slightly when I'd added that they'd thought my medical bills would bankrupt them, but I'd ended up wealthier than they'd ever be. The host had seemed torn between being happy for my success and horrified by my family's cruelty, had said something about how remarkable my recovery had been both physically and professionally. I hadn't known while I'd been sitting in that studio doing the interview that Linda and Sarah and Michael were watching from wherever they'd ended up after abandoning me, hadn't known that millions of people including my family were seeing me on their television screens talking about what they'd done to me. I'd flown back home after the interview feeling good about how it had gone, had thought maybe some people would see it and would be inspired by the story of surviving abandonment and building something meaningful, but I hadn't expected what happened next. My lawyer had called me that same afternoon, just a few hours after the Good Morning America segment had aired, had told me something that had made my blood run cold. He'd said he'd received multiple phone calls that morning from people claiming to be my family, that Linda had called first and then Sarah and then Michael, all of them within 2 hours of the broadcast finishing. All of them wanting to get in touch with me after 6 months of complete silence. He'd asked if I wanted their contact information or if I wanted him to relay any messages. had told me he could block them entirely if I preferred, but I'd been curious about what they wanted. Had wanted to know what could possibly make them reach out after maintaining radio silence through my entire hospitalization and recovery. My lawyer had said he'd taken detailed notes on each call and would email them to me. Had said I should read them before deciding how to respond. Had warned me that what they'd said would probably make me angry. I'd read the email from my lawyer within minutes of him sending it, had seen the summaries of each phone call laid out in his precise legal language, had felt rage building as I'd understood exactly why my family had suddenly decided to contact me. They hadn't called because they'd felt guilty seeing me talk about their abandonment on national television, hadn't reached out because they'd been moved by my recovery or impressed by my resilience, had contacted me for one reason only, which was money. Linda's call had come first, according to my lawyer's notes. She'd phoned his office at 9:30 in the morning, which meant she'd called within 90 minutes of the interview airing, had been watching Good Morning America, and had seen her abandoned husband talking about building a $50 million company. My lawyer had written that Linda had been crying on the phone, had said she'd made a terrible mistake leaving me at the hospital, had claimed she'd been scared and overwhelmed, and hadn't been thinking clearly when she'd written that note abandoning me. She'd told my lawyer that seeing me on television had made her realize what she'd lost, that she'd spent 6 months regretting her decision but hadn't known how to reach out and apologize, that she wanted a chance to reconcile and rebuild our marriage. My lawyer had asked her directly why she was calling now after 6 months of silence, and she'd apparently stumbled over her answer, had eventually said that seeing me successful and healthy had made her understand that her fears about me being a burden had been unfounded. That clearly I was thriving and could provide for myself, which meant reconciliation wouldn't be the financial drain she'd worried about. The transparency of her motivation had been stunning, even though I'd expected exactly this kind of response. She wasn't calling because she loved me or missed me or felt guilty about abandoning me. She was calling because she'd seen that the burden she'd walked away from had become a multimillionaire, and she wanted access to that wealth. My lawyer had noted in his email that Linda had specifically asked multiple times about my equity stake and the company's valuation, had wanted to know if I was really worth $10 million like I'd said on television, had been calculating her potential share of my success, even while crying about how sorry she was. Sarah had called about an hour after Linda. My lawyer's notes showed she'd phoned at 10:45 and had been more composed than her mother, but equally transparent in her motivations. She'd told my lawyer that she'd been thinking about me constantly since the accident, that she'd wanted to reach out so many times but hadn't known what to say, that seeing me on Good Morning America had given her the courage to finally make contact. She'd said she missed me and wanted a chance to rebuild our father-daughter relationship, wanted to be part of my life again, wanted me to know she was proud of what I'd accomplished. My lawyer had asked Sarah the same question he'd asked Linda about why she was calling now, and Sarah had been slightly more honest in her answer, had admitted that seeing me successful had made her realize what the family had lost by abandoning me, that she'd understood while watching the interview that walking away had been a mistake that had cost them all a relationship with someone who was clearly remarkable and valuable. The language she'd used had been telling, describing me as valuable like I was an asset rather than her father, making it clear she understood my worth in financial terms more than emotional ones. Michael's call had come last. My lawyer's notes showed he'd phoned just after noon, and his approach had been completely different from Linda's tears and Sarah's calculated emotional appeal. Michael had been direct and almost demanding, according to my lawyer, had said that he was my son and I owed him consideration, that family was supposed to support each other and share in success, that he deserved to benefit from what I'd built because we were related by blood. My lawyer had written that Michael had specifically said the words "you owe us," had claimed that everything I'd accomplished was somehow owed to my family, that my success created an obligation to share with them financially. He'd apparently said that they'd been through a traumatic experience too with the accident, that they deserved compensation for their suffering, that abandoning me had been a difficult decision they'd made under stress, and I should forgive them and share my wealth with them now that I clearly had plenty to spare. The entitlement in Michael's call had been breathtaking. He'd somehow convinced himself that leaving me to die alone in a hospital created a claim on my success rather than destroying any relationship we'd had believed that sharing DNA meant he deserved access to money I'd earned while he'd been blocking my phone calls. Not one of them had offered a sincere apology. Not one had acknowledged the cruelty of what they'd done without immediately pivoting to what they wanted from me now. Not one had shown any genuine remorse for abandoning me when I'd needed them most. My lawyer had also saved the voicemails they'd left on his office phone, had included audio files in his email so I could hear their actual voices after 6 months of silence, and I'd made myself listen to each one because I'd needed to hear exactly how they sounded when they were asking for money from the man they'd abandoned. Linda's voicemail had been the longest, almost 3 minutes of her crying and talking about how proud she was of me, how she'd always known I was capable of great things, how seeing me on television had reminded her of all the reasons she'd fallen in love with me. She'd said that leaving me at the hospital had been the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd spent every day of the past 6 months regretting that decision, that she'd been too ashamed to reach out because she'd known how badly she'd hurt me. Her voice had trembled as she'd talked about how much she missed me, how empty her life had been without me in it, how she'd realized that money didn't matter compared to being with the person you loved. The performance had been impressive if you didn't know she'd spent 6 months completely silent while I'd fought to survive, if you couldn't hear the calculation under the emotion, if you didn't notice how she'd mentioned my equity stake and company valuation 3 separate times while claiming money didn't matter. Near the end of her voicemail, Linda had said she thought we'd made a mistake at the hospital, had used the word "we like." This had been a mutual decision rather than her abandoning me while I'd been unconscious, had suggested that both of us had been scared and overwhelmed rather than admitting she'd made a unilateral choice to protect herself financially. She'd asked if we could talk about reconciliation, had said she wanted a chance to explain and apologize properly, had given my lawyer her new phone number, and had asked him to pass it along to me with her love. Sarah's voicemail had been shorter but more calculated. She'd clearly thought through what she wanted to say before leaving the message, had struck a tone that was apologetic without being overly emotional. She'd said that seeing me on Good Morning America had been shocking, that she'd had no idea I'd built a company or become successful, that she'd spent 6 months assuming I was still in rehabilitation struggling with my injuries. The lie had been obvious since she'd blocked my number and had refused all contact, had made no effort to check on my condition or my recovery, had only become interested once she'd seen me on national television talking about being worth millions. She'd said she missed me and wanted a relationship with her father again, had talked about how much she'd learned from me growing up and how she'd realized she needed me in her life, had mentioned that she was going through some difficult times and could really use my guidance and support. The manipulation had been transparent. She'd been setting up an ask for money by framing it as needing guidance, had been trying to appeal to my role as a father while ignoring that she'd abandoned that role when she'd walked out of the hospital 6 months ago. Sarah had ended her voicemail by saying she'd always be proud to be my daughter, that nothing could change the bond between us, that she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive the mistake they'd all made under traumatic circumstances. She'd given my lawyer her contact information and had asked him to tell me she loved me, had said she was ready to talk whenever I was ready, had made it sound like I was the one who needed to come around rather than her being the one who'd abandoned her father when he was fighting for his life. Michael's voicemail had been the most honest in its greed. Even though he'd tried to dress it up in family obligation language, he'd started by saying he'd seen me on television and had been shocked to learn about my success, had said he'd assumed I was still recovering and struggling, not building multi-million-dollar companies. He'd said that as my son, he had a right to be part of my success, that family was supposed to support each other through good times and bad, that the fact that I'd become wealthy meant I had an obligation to share that wealth with my children. He'd actually used the words "you owe us," had said it directly, without any pretense of emotional appeal or reconciliation, had just stated flat out that he believed my success created a debt to him that needed to be paid. He'd mentioned that he and Sarah had both been struggling financially since the accident, that they'd used up their share of the house sale proceeds and were facing difficulties, that seeing me worth millions while they were struggling felt wrong and unfair given that we were family. Michael had ended his message by saying that he expected me to do the right thing, that he was sure once I thought about it, I'd realize that helping out my children was the decent thing to do, that he'd be waiting to hear from me about how we could work out a fair arrangement. The entitlement had been staggering. He'd somehow believed that abandoning me at my lowest point entitled him to share in my highest point, that leaving me to die alone created a claim on money I'd earned through my own determination and work. Not one of the 3 messages had included a real apology. Not one had acknowledged the specific cruelty of what they'd done without immediately asking for something in return. Not one had shown any understanding of how devastating their abandonment had been, or any genuine remorse for causing that pain. They'd all seen the same interview where I'd talked about being left alone in a hospital bed, had heard me describe the note Linda had written saying they had to think of their own futures, had listened to me explain how I'd built my success out of the determination to prove them wrong, and their response had been to immediately contact me asking for money. The timing had been so perfectly transparent, 6 months of complete silence followed by 3 phone calls within hours of learning I was wealthy, 6 months of not caring whether I was alive or dead, followed by sudden interest once they'd seen I was successful. If I'd still been in that rehab facility struggling to walk, if the startup had failed and I'd been broke and disabled, if I'd been on that television show talking about my recovery without mentioning millions of dollars, none of them would have called. None of them would have wanted reconciliation. None of them would have remembered I existed. I'd spent about an hour reading and rereading my lawyer's notes and listening to those voicemails, had let myself feel the full weight of their audacity and greed and manipulation. And then I'd called my lawyer back and had told him exactly what I wanted him to do. I'd asked him to draft a formal response to all 3 of them, something that would make it absolutely clear that their abandonment had permanent consequences, that walking away from me when I was broken didn't entitle them to come back when I was whole, that I was done with all of them forever. My lawyer had been supportive, had said he'd been hoping I'd tell him to cut them off completely, had admitted that listening to their voicemails had made him angry on my behalf because the manipulation had been so transparent. He'd asked me what specifically I wanted the response to say, and I'd told him to remind them of their own words, to quote back the note Linda had written about having to think of their own futures, to make them confront what they'd actually done before they tried to rewrite history as some kind of mutual mistake made under stress. The letter my lawyer had drafted had been perfect, had been professional and legally precise, while also being emotionally devastating in ways I'd needed it to be. It had started by acknowledging receipt of their calls and messages, had noted that all 3 of them had contacted my office within hours of my television appearance, had made the timing explicit so they couldn't pretend this was anything other than a response to learning about my wealth. The letter had then quoted directly from Linda's note that she'd left at the hospital, had included the exact words "you had to think of your own futures because my injuries would bankrupt you." The letter had stated clearly that I had respected their decision at the time, that when they'd chosen to abandon me because my medical needs were too expensive and too burdensome, I'd accepted that choice and had survived without them. That I'd spent 6 months recovering and building my company without any support or contact from the family that had written me off. It had pointed out that during those 6 months, they'd had countless opportunities to reach out, to check on my recovery, to express any regret for their decision, but they'd maintained complete silence and had only made contact after learning I was successful and wealthy. The letter had addressed their requests for reconciliation directly, had stated that reconciliation requires genuine remorse and understanding of harm caused, neither of which had been evident in their messages that had focused primarily on my financial success and their desire to benefit from it. It had noted that Linda had mentioned my company valuation multiple times while claiming money didn't matter, that Sarah had talked about going through difficult times and needing support in ways that clearly meant financial support, that Michael had explicitly stated I owed them and had demanded a fair arrangement for sharing my wealth. My lawyer had written that I was now thinking of my own future, had used their exact phrase back at them to drive home the point that they'd taught me this lesson, that they'd shown me it was acceptable to prioritize your own well-being and financial security over family obligations when the cost became too high. The letter had stated that just as they'd decided my injuries and medical bills were too much of a burden to bear, I was deciding that their abandonment and betrayal were too much of a burden to forgive, that I was choosing to protect my own future, just as they'd chosen to protect theirs 6 months ago. The letter had made clear that I didn't want reconciliation, didn't want contact, Didn't want them to have any part of the life I'd built after they'd walked away from me, that the success they wanted to share in had been built specifically to prove them wrong about my value and my worth. It had stated that they didn't get to abandon someone when they were broken and reclaim them when they were whole. Didn't get to decide I was worthless when I was disabled and valuable when I was wealthy. Didn't get to treat love and family as conditional on financial benefit and then demand inclusion when the finances changed. The final paragraph had been direct and unambiguous, had instructed all three of them not to contact me again through any means, had stated that any further attempts to reach me would be considered harassment and would be handled accordingly, had made clear that this decision was final and not open to negotiation or discussion. My lawyer had sent this letter to all three of them simultaneously, had made sure they each received identical copies so they couldn't claim they'd been singled out or treated differently, had created a paper trail that documented my refusal to reconcile in case they tried to challenge it later. But I hadn't stopped with just the letter, had taken additional steps to make sure they couldn't worm their way back into my life through persistence or manipulation. I'd blocked all their phone numbers from my personal cell, had updated my contact information with the hospital and my doctors to make clear that my family was not to be given any information about my medical care or whereabouts, had instructed my lawyer to handle any future communication from them so I'd never have to hear their voices or read their words again. I'd also talked to David and our company's head of security about the situation, had explained that my estranged family might try to show up at our office or at company events now that they knew I was successful, had made it clear that under no circumstances should Linda or Sarah or Michael be allowed entry to any company property or be given any information about my schedule. Security had added their names and photos to a watch list, had briefed the reception staff about not letting them through, had made sure everyone knew these people were not welcome, despite being technically related to me. David had been supportive and had actually suggested we could get restraining orders if they tried to push the issue, had offered to have company lawyers handle it if my family became aggressive about trying to contact me, had made clear that the entire company had my back in keeping these people out of my life. The team had known my story from the beginning, had known about the abandonment, and had watched me build my success out of that pain, and they were protective of me in ways my actual family had never been. I'd felt enormous relief once all these measures were in place, had felt like I'd finally closed the door on the family that had abandoned me, had created barriers between me and the people who'd caused me so much pain. The letter my lawyer had sent would make it clear there was no path back, no amount of apologizing or explaining that would change my mind, no possibility that their greed would be rewarded with access to the wealth I'd built specifically to prove them wrong about my worth. I'm 52 years old now, walking with a cane that I'll need for the rest of my life, but walking nonetheless, worth over $10 million from equity in a company that continues to grow and expand into new markets, surrounded by people like David and my physical therapists and my startup team who valued me when I had absolutely nothing to offer except determination and insight. My life 6 months after the accident bears no resemblance to the nightmare I was living when my family abandoned me at that hospital. I've gone from being a broken man with catastrophic debt facing permanent disability to being a successful entrepreneur whose story inspires other people who've been written off or abandoned. The company David and I built together has expanded beyond our original diagnostic software. We've developed multiple products that are being used in hospitals across the country. We've hired over 100 employees who are passionate about improving healthcare. We've become a significant player in the medical technology industry, with competitors taking us seriously and investors betting on our continued success. My 20% equity stake has grown in value as the company has grown. Recent valuations put us at over $70 million, which means I'm worth more than $14 million on paper now, and we're in discussions about either going public or being acquired by a larger company which would turn that paper wealth into actual liquid assets. I've been able to pay off all my medical debt using loans secured against my equity, have moved out of that rehab facility into a beautiful, accessible apartment that accommodates my mobility needs, have bought a car modified for my physical limitations, have built a life that's comfortable and dignified and completely independent of the family that thought I'd be a burden forever. The $340,000 in medical bills that had terrified Linda so much that she'd abandoned me has become completely irrelevant compared to my net worth. The financial catastrophe she'd been so desperate to avoid by leaving me has turned into prosperity she'll never share in. I haven't heard from Linda or Sarah or Michael since my lawyer sent that letter 3 months ago. They apparently got the message that reconciliation wasn't possible and that their abandonment had permanent consequences they'd have to live with forever. I don't know where they are or what they're doing, and I've made peace with never knowing, have accepted that the people who raised me and married me and shared my life for decades are now just strangers I used to know, people who made a choice that ended our relationship permanently and irrevocably. Sometimes I think about what my life would have looked like if they hadn't abandoned me, if Linda had stayed by my bedside during my recovery and Sarah and Michael had visited me in the hospital and we'd faced my injuries as a family, the way families are supposed to face hardship. I probably would have recovered more slowly, without the rage and determination that came from abandonment, probably wouldn't have pushed myself as hard in physical therapy, or thrown myself into work with such intensity, probably would have been content with a modest recovery and a quiet life, rather than building something extraordinary to prove them wrong. Their cruelty had inadvertently given me a gift, even though that hadn't been their intention. Their abandonment had created a fire in me that had driven every achievement of the past 6 months, had turned a broken man into someone who refused to accept limitations or defeat, or the idea that his value was determined by his physical ability. I'd built my success on the foundation of their rejection, had used their note about thinking of their own futures as fuel every time I'd wanted to give up or accept that recovery was too hard, or believe that maybe they'd been right about me being a burden. The people at my company had become more of a family to me than my blood relatives had ever been. David treated me like a brother and celebrated my victories and supported me through setbacks. My team valued my contributions and made me feel essential rather than expendable. The relationships I'd built in 6 months of working together were deeper and more genuine than anything I'd had with Linda or the kids in decades of living together. These people had chosen to be in my life, had earned their place there through loyalty and support and genuine care, hadn't just been stuck with me through biology or legal obligation. My family had left me at a hospital 6 months ago, with a note saying my injuries would bankrupt them and they had to think of their own futures, had abandoned me while I was unconscious and fighting to survive injuries I'd sustained protecting them in a car accident, had walked away without looking back because they'd decided I was too broken and too expensive to be worth their time. 6 months later, they'd seen me on Good Morning America discussing the $50 million company I'd built while recovering from those injuries, had watched me casually mention my $10 million equity stake, had heard me explain that being abandoned had actually helped me, because it had forced me to prove my value beyond my physical mobility. They'd called my lawyer within hours wanting reconciliation, had left voicemails crying about mistakes and asking for second chances, had exposed themselves completely by focusing on my wealth while pretending to care about rebuilding relationships. I'd given them the same consideration they'd given me when I was unconscious, in ICU fighting for my life. I'd told them I was thinking of my own future now, just like they'd taught me. I'd blocked their numbers and had refused all contact and had made it clear they'd never see a penny of the success I'd built from the hospital bed where they'd abandoned me. Some families stick together through hardship and come out stronger on the other side, but mine had abandoned me at my lowest point because they'd valued money and convenience more than they'd valued me as a person. They didn't get to celebrate my highest point, didn't get to benefit from the wealth I'd created, didn't get to claim pride in my accomplishments when they'd predicted I'd be nothing but a burden. The family that left me at the hospital will never walk through the door of the life I built after they walked away, will spend the rest of their lives knowing they abandoned a man who became everything they'd wanted for themselves, will carry the knowledge that their cruelty cost them millions of dollars and a relationship with someone who turned out to be worth keeping after all. My family left me at the hospital after a car accident, said my injuries would bankrupt them, that they had to think of their futures. 6 months later, they saw me on TV discussing the $50 million company I'd built while recovering. They called wanting reconciliation. I told them I was thinking of my future now, just like they taught me. They abandoned the burden. The burden became a multi-millionaire. They'll never see a penny.